The day I came home from 6 months in Fort McMurray, I didn't expect a party. I didn't even expect dinner on the table. But I did expect my husband to open the door. He didn't. I stood on the front porch of our house in Barrie, the house I'd been paying the mortgage on while working 12-hour shifts at the oil sands campus as camp. And I knocked. Then I knocked again. Then I called his name. My neighbor, Mrs. Pemberton, peeked through her curtain and quickly looked away. That was the first sign. I just didn't know how to read it yet. My name is not important right now. What matters is that I'm 51 years old. I spent 22 years as a registered nurse, the last 4 of them taking 6-month rotation contracts in northern Alberta, because the pay was 3 times what I made at the hospital in Barrie, and we needed it. My husband, Kevin, had been laid off from the GM plant in Oshawa in 2019. He did odd jobs here and there, some handyman work, some weekend shifts at Canadian Tire, but nothing steady. I didn't resent that. People go through hard times. I loved him. I thought we were a team. I went north so we could get ahead, pay off the line of credit, maybe finally finish the basement, give our marriage some breathing room after years of just surviving. Kevin drove me to the Barrie bus terminal the morning I left. He kissed me on the cheek. He said, "Text me when you land." I did. He replied 3 hours later with a thumbs up. I should have paid more attention to that thumbs up. That little gray thumbs up. But I was already tired and already in the camp van, and I told myself he was just busy. For 6 months, I told myself a lot of things. I told myself it was normal that our calls got shorter. I told myself he was stressed about money, even though I was sending him $3,000 a month over and above what I needed for myself. I told myself that men sometimes pull away when they feel emasculated, that I shouldn't push, that I should give him space. My coworker, a woman named Deborah who'd done 4 of these rotations and was on her 2nd marriage because of the first one, told me straight up one night in the cafeteria, "The ones who go quiet aren't resting, they're hiding." I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. When I finally got back to Barrie on a Thursday afternoon in late October, Kevin's truck was in the driveway. I had my rolling suitcase and my duffel bag and the little cactus I'd somehow kept alive in my camp room for 6 months because I needed something living to look after. I knocked. I rang the bell. I called out his name through the door, and then I heard a woman's voice inside. I want to say I immediately understood. I want to say I was calm. I wasn't. I just stood there on my own porch with my cactus in one hand and my suitcase handle in the other, and my brain just went completely white, like a television with no signal. Kevin opened the door eventually. He was wearing the flannel shirt I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. He looked at me like I was a door-to-door salesperson he was trying to get rid of. "You said you were coming back Friday," he said. I said Thursday. I had the text right there on my phone. I'd sent it the night before. "Who's inside?" He told me it was his cousin from Sudbury who was in town for work. He said it very quickly, the way people say things they've rehearsed. His cousin from Sudbury is a man named Don. I've met Don. Don is 6'2" and does not have a high-pitched laugh. I didn't say any of that. I just asked if I could come into my own house. He let me in. The woman, I'll call her what she was, because I don't have the energy for careful language anymore, was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug that had my name on it. Literally. My name on a mug. A gift from my daughter Tessa. Kevin introduced her as a friend. Her name was Amber. She was maybe 35 and she had the grace to look uncomfortable, which I respected honestly, because at least one person in that kitchen had the decency to be ashamed. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I picked up my cactus, took my suitcase to the spare bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for about 45 minutes. Then I called my mother. My mother and I have always been close, or I thought we were. She and my father live in Collingwood, about 40 minutes from Barrie. I've been their oldest daughter, and their responsible one, my entire life. The one who remembered birthdays and drove Dad to his cardiology appointments, and showed up at every family dinner, even the ones after a 24-hour shift where I could barely keep my eyes open. I called her from the spare bedroom, voice low, and I told her what I'd walked in on. I told her about Amber and the mug with my name and Kevin's expression at the door. There was a pause on the line. "Are you sure you're not misreading the situation?" she said. "Kevin called us last week. He said you've been very stressed. He said the job up north has changed you." I remember closing my eyes. "Mom, there was a woman in my kitchen." "A friend," he said. "He mentioned he might have a friend over while you were away. We knew about it. They knew about it. They knew about Amber." They had been told, preemptively by Kevin, And they had accepted that framing so completely that when I called in genuine distress, my mother's first instinct was to question my perception. I want to give you the full picture of what Kevin had done in the 6 months I was away, because it took me weeks to piece it all together. He had opened a home equity line of credit using our house as collateral, in both our names, my signature on the application, which I never signed. That was the first thing. Our house in Barrie, which I had been paying down for 11 years, suddenly had $60,000 borrowed against it, and I had no idea. He had stopped paying the joint credit card, the one I'd been sending money for specifically, and let it go to collections. My credit score, when I finally checked it in November, had dropped by over 200 points. He had told my family, my parents, my younger brother Sean, and my sister Paulette, that I had become difficult since taking the northern contracts, that I was emotionally distant, that I had become controlling about money, that he was worried about me. He had, in other words, spent 6 months building a case. While I was working nights in a camp kitchen, smelling of diesel and industrial cleaner, sending money home, keeping a cactus alive because I needed something to take care of, my husband was constructing an alternate version of me and distributing it to everyone I loved. My family believed him. Paulette called me 2 days after I got home. I was still in the spare bedroom at that point, still in some kind of shock, going through our financial statements on my laptop with a yellow notepad beside me. Paulette said, and I will remember this until the day I die, you need to think about why he felt he needed to look elsewhere. I hung up. Sean texted me the next morning. He said Kevin had called him, and that Kevin was very upset, and that maybe I should consider that my job choices had put a strain on the marriage. He said he wasn't taking sides. People who say they're not taking sides are always taking a side. My parents didn't call that first week, not once. I'd been back in my own house for 4 days when Kevin told me he wanted me to leave. He said he needed space to think. He said the house was tense. He said it like it was my fault that the house was tense, like I was the one who had brought a stranger into the kitchen. Like I was the one who had borrowed $60,000 against our home without telling anyone. I left. Not because I had to legally. My name was on that deed, but because I was so exhausted from the shock of everything that fighting for the physical space felt impossible on top of everything else. I packed 2 bags. I took my laptop and my financial documents and my cactus. I drove to a Comfort Inn on Dunlop Street and I sat in a room with beige walls and a view of the parking lot, and I thought, this is what 51 years of trying your hardest gets you. I called the hospital to see about getting my old position back. My unit manager, a woman I'd worked with for years, said there might be something in the new year. I applied to every rental listing in Barrie that allowed pets, even though I didn't have a pet, because I thought I might get one. Something to take care of. I called a lawyer. His name was Mr. Fournier. Not the flashy kind of lawyer you see on billboards, just a quiet man in a small office on Collier Street who wore the same gray cardigan both times I met him, and who listened to me lay out every document with a patience that made me want to cry in relief. He looked at the home equity line of credit application. He looked at the signature. That's not my signature, I told him. I can see that, he said. He explained to me that what Kevin had done was potentially fraud, that the forged signature on a credit application was a criminal matter, not just a civil one, that I had options I hadn't considered. I didn't sleep much those weeks. I lay in the Comfort Inn bed, and I went through the documents over and over. I traced where the money from the line of credit had gone. Some of it went to Kevin's personal account. Some of it went to what I eventually figured out was a joint account he'd opened with Amber, in a different province, using a postal address in Calgary that turned out to be a mailbox service. Amber, it seemed, was not from Sudbury. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in December. It was on the 3rd floor of a building in the south end of Barrie, and it had a radiator that clanked at 3 a.m, and a window that looked out onto the highway. I paid first and last from my camp savings, which Kevin had not been able to access because I'd kept that account entirely separate. That was the one smart thing I had done, not because I suspected anything, but because my mother had always told me to keep a little something that was yours alone. I had listened to that advice, ironically, from the very woman who later told me to think about why he needed to look elsewhere. I put my cactus on the windowsill with the highway view and I went back to work. I got a contract at RVH, Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, in January, casual at first, then regular part-time by March. I was good at my job. I had always been good at my job. That part of my identity, at least, no one had been able to touch. My family remained quiet. Not hostile exactly. Paulette sent a Christmas card with a generic "hope you're well" inside, but absent in any meaningful way. My mother texted once in January to ask how I was doing. I replied that I was managing. She sent a heart emoji and that was the end of it. I didn't beg for contact. I had been begging for understanding since the day I got home and I was done with it. I had a lawyer. I had a job. I had an apartment and a cactus and a radiator that clanked and a view of the highway, and for the first time in years I knew exactly where every dollar of my money was. There's a specific kind of loneliness in being wronged and not believed. It's not the loneliness of being alone. I've been alone before and I know how to manage that. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people who knew you, who watched you grow up and struggle and work and show up, and who looked at a man who married into your life 6 years ago and decided to believe him instead of you. You start to wonder what they saw when they looked at you all those years. Whether you were ever actually seen. I went to therapy. My therapist's name was Dr. Vasquez. She was a tall woman with reading glasses on a chain who specialized in what she called relational betrayal, which I had never heard of but which turned out to describe my situation precisely. Our townhouse wasn't fancy. She said something in our third session that I have written down and still think about. She said that when people in our lives choose to believe someone who has harmed us, it's rarely because they're cruel. It's because believing the truth requires them to accept that they were also fooled, and that is a much harder thing for most people to sit with. I sat with it. The legal process was slow. I won't pretend it was clean or cinematic because it wasn't. It took 8 months. There were forms and deadlines, and a mediation session that went badly and a second one that went slightly less badly. Kevin hired a lawyer and initially tried to claim the signature on the credit application was mine, that I had signed remotely, electronically, which was not how that application worked and which Mr. Fournier dismantled fairly efficiently. The bank's own records showed the application had been completed in person at a branch in Barrie, while I was documented to be in Fort McMurray. Kevin eventually settled. He did not go to jail. The Crown looked at the case and opted not to pursue criminal charges, which Mr. Fournier had told me was a realistic possibility given the amounts and the complexity of proving intent. But in the civil settlement, Kevin was required to repay the equity line in full from his share of the house proceeds, which meant that when the house sold in August, to a young family from Toronto who fell in love with the backyard, I walked away with what I was owed, minus legal fees, minus the months of stress, minus things you can't put a dollar figure on. I also walked away from the marriage with my credit score restored, a letter from the bank acknowledging the fraudulent application, and a clear record that the joint credit card delinquency had not been my doing. The credit bureau process took another 3 months, but by autumn my score was back. I tell you all of this not because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm past that, but because I want you to understand what starting over at 51 actually looks like. It doesn't look like a movie. It looks like sitting in a lawyer's office with a cardigan-wearing man, going through bank statements line by line. It looks like eating cereal for dinner because you don't have the energy to cook. It looks like calling your therapist from a parking lot because you cried in the grocery store for no specific reason. It looks like very small, very undramatic acts of continuing to function. My daughter Tessa, she's 26 and lives in Ottawa, works in public policy, had been mostly quiet through all of this, not because she didn't care, but because she was processing it herself. Kevin had been her stepfather since she was 20. She'd liked him. She told me later she'd felt betrayed too, that she'd been furious, but that she'd needed time to understand what had happened before she could talk to me about it without crying. She drove up from Ottawa in September, showed up at my apartment door with 2 bags of groceries and a bottle of Ontario wine and spent the weekend. We talked for most of it. Not always about Kevin, about everything, the way you do when you've been not talking for too long. She noticed the cactus on the windowsill. "That's the one from the camp," she said. 6 months in Fort McMurray and 8 months of my marriage falling apart, I said. "Still alive." She laughed and I laughed, and it was the first time I had laughed in so long that it surprised me, physically, like a sneeze. My family learned the truth gradually, and not from me. It started with Sean, actually. Sean works in financial services. He's a branch manager at a credit union in Guelph, and Kevin, in what I can only describe as a spectacular miscalculation, had approached Sean in the spring asking for a personal loan. Kevin's version was that I had taken money from the house sale that was rightfully his, and that he was fighting to recover it. He wanted $12,000 to cover legal fees and living expenses. Sean asked to see the documentation. Kevin did not have documentation that held up. Sean, being who he is, started asking questions. He called Mr. Fournier's office, not to interfere, just to understand, and while Mr. Fournier couldn't share case specifics, he was able to confirm certain public facts about the proceedings. Sean did some digging on his own. He called the bank. He had connections in the financial world that allowed him to see things that I, the person who had been directly harmed, had not thought to check. He called me in May. The conversation was not easy. Sean is not someone who apologizes easily. None of us are. We come from a family that prides itself on not being wrong. But he said something that night that I will give him credit for forever. He said, "I want you to know that I didn't ask questions when I should have. I accepted what I was told. That wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry." I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't. But I said I appreciated him saying it. He told my parents. I don't know exactly what that conversation looked like, but it happened in June, because my mother called me on a Sunday morning in late June. It was early, just past 8. I was still in bed, which is unusual for me, but I'd had a night shift the Friday before and I was still catching up. My phone showed her name and I lay there looking at it for a long time before I answered. She cried. My mother is not a crier. She's a practical, private woman from a generation that did not put emotion on display. So the fact that she was crying told me something had genuinely broken through. She said she was sorry. She said she had been fooled and that she had let herself be fooled because it was easier than believing something painful about someone she'd welcomed into the family. That was more self-awareness than I had expected from her. I want to be fair about that. I told her I needed time. I told her I wasn't ready to go back to Sunday dinners and pretend everything was resolved. She said she understood. I'm not sure she fully did, but she didn't argue. Paulette was last. Paulette and I have always had the more complicated relationship. We are too similar in some ways, both stubborn, both certain we are right, and that had created friction between us long before Kevin. She didn't call for another 2 months after my mother. When she finally did, it was a text first. "Can I call you?" I said yes. She was defensive at the start, which is Paulette's way of being afraid. She kept starting sentences with "I didn't know," and you have to understand from my perspective. I let her talk. I had learned by then to let people finish before I responded. Dr. Vasquez had helped with that. Eventually, Paulette ran out of defensive sentences and there was a silence on the line. "He played all of us," she said finally. "Yes," I said. "He did. I still should have called you. I should have just called you and asked." "Yes," I said, "you should have." There was another silence. "I'm sorry," she said. And it came out differently than I expected. Not polished, not careful. Just tired and honest. I didn't forgive everyone at once. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a story people want to hear where the family comes back together, and everything is resolved in a warm kitchen with tea and tears, and everyone understands each other. That's not what happened. Reconciliation has been slow and imperfect, and sometimes frustrating. My mother and I have dinner once a month, and we are still figuring out how to talk to each other in a new way. Sean and I are probably the closest we've ever been, which is something I hadn't expected. Paulette and I are a work in progress, but we are working on it. That counts for something. I got a full-time position at RVH in November. I moved to a larger apartment in the spring. Still South End Barrie, still 3rd floor, but bigger windows and a proper second room that I turned into a home office. I put the cactus on the new windowsill. It has 2 new growths coming off the side that weren't there when I got it. I started mentoring a few of the newer nurses at the hospital, particularly the ones doing long-distance contracts, who were navigating the particular stress of being away from home. I tell them what Deborah told me in the cafeteria at camp, the woman on her second marriage. The ones who go quiet aren't resting, and I tell them the thing Deborah didn't say, the thing I had to learn on my own. Trust the quiet too. Trust what you know to be true about yourself, even when the people who love you are telling you a different story. Especially then. Last spring, I drove past the old house on my way to a physio appointment. Someone had painted the front door red. We'd always talked about doing that, Kevin and I, and never had. There was a minivan in the driveway, and a bike left on the front lawn, and some kind of wind spinner in the garden. It looked like a home. I kept driving. There's a particular kind of peace that comes not from things being resolved, or people being punished, or justice arriving in a clean and satisfying way. It comes from looking at your life. The apartment with the big windows, the cactus with its new growth, the shift that starts at 7, the daughter who drove 4 hours to bring you groceries, and knowing that you built it, that it's yours. I'm 51 years old. I know where every dollar of my money is. I know who I am when the door closes. And I know, now, that those things were always more mine than I realized. I just had to lose everything else to see them clearly.